Good morning, everyone. Might have to staple that down. Appreciate the presence of everyone this morning as we begin our Bible study here and look into God's Word for the lessons He wants to teach us today. We're going to be going to the Gospel of Luke and going to chapter 12. One of the recurring themes throughout the New Testament, starting with the foundational teachings of Jesus, of course, and then continued by the apostles, is the Christian attitude towards material things. How are we to treat the things that we need for everyday life? And especially if one finds oneself in possession of an abundance of material things, what is our attitude towards those things to be? In other words, how do you behave as a Christian with riches? What do you do with your money when you're following Jesus? Now, there are many people out there in the world today that will sell you courses, they'll sell you books, they will sell you on materials that'll tell you exactly why God thinks you should handle your money in a way such that you become rich. They'll use words like stewardship. They'll use words like financial responsibility. And they'll dress it up as a discipleship practice to be someone who becomes rich by handling money well. I have to tell you that if you go to Jesus and you look for financial advice, none of what he tells you is going to make you rich. The guy who tells you, sell everything you have and give to the poor, is not concerned with how much interest you're earning on your savings account. The guy who says, oh, look at the flowers, God clothes them, and look at the birds, he feeds them, is not concerned with the equity you're building in the properties you own. Jesus is not a wealth generation God. If you want a God who wants to make you rich, you're going to have to go to the outside world and find a different religion. I hear in India, Ganesha is really good about making people rich, so maybe you can pray to him. He's even got an elephant head, so it's kind of fun. But jokes aside, the main thing I'm trying to tell you today is that if you think that Christianity is about wealth, you've got the wrong religion. What Christianity is about is spiritual growth on a personal level, community, and about a devotion to a God who loved us first. If you haven't learned that through the lessons we've been going over the last few weeks where we've been talking about love, they're all on YouTube. Go listen to them again. The love that God has for us is best emulated through the example he gave in Jesus. And so the teachings on the way we are to handle our things, and especially whether or not we are to love things, is best taught by Jesus. So we're going to look at two passages from Luke's gospel today and look at Jesus' attitude towards material things, and specifically whether or not it is godly to love money. That's the main thing. Is anything that we do with regard to our possessions godly, and do we need to change to fit Jesus? Now, I'm not up here to tell you any of my opinions. If I do, you can correct me out of Scripture. I'm just going to tell you purely what Jesus said with a little explanation, and I hope it's helpful. But if a little of this stings, blame Jesus. Don't come after me. Let's start with verse 1 of chapter 12 of Luke. Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, be on guard against your yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. I wanted to start with just this one verse before we go into the parable he's going to teach, because I want you to know who is it that Jesus is teaching against, okay? A lot of the times, Jesus is teaching towards an idea. He wants you to understand spiritual growth. He wants you to understand your responsibility to God. He wants to understand who God is. But sometimes he teaches things about people. And you're going to see, as he is going through his whole life, there are certain people with certain attitudes that he has to correct rather than simply put out forward a positive message of do. He has to say, don't be like them. So let's look at verse 13 now. Verse 13 says the following. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." He told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." There's a problem in the world that Jesus was in that I believe, from the evidence of my own personal experience and from what you can see on current events on the news and everywhere else, that this world has a problem with abundance. Specifically, that abundance is not always distributed evenly. It's not that there's not enough stuff in the world to go around, it's the going around that's not happening. It's not that there's not enough stuff to feed everybody, it's that the guy with the biggest table doesn't bring the right people to the seats to eat. And so when Jesus is talking to these people, he's not talking about something that would normally be considered an unreasonable request, right? Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. He's not being fair. He's not giving me my share or my half of what it is. I've had a lot of preachers come through and tell me, well, it's because the older the younger brother gets a certain shares based on the Old Testament law, and so therefore the man was being unreasonable because you can't split it down the middle. You've got to follow the Old Testament law, and he wants Jesus to break the law by telling him to split it. I don't know where they get that from. All it says is divide the inheritance, not split it down the middle. You know, an eighth is just as much of a division as half is, right? So I don't know where they get that they want Jesus to break the law nonsense from. Jesus says what he wants to say. Jesus says life does not consist of an abundance of possessions. That's the lesson that he wants these men to take away. That's the lesson that he wants to teach. And the parable that he gives to explain this is very straightforward. There's a few of the parables, especially since we don't live in a highly agrarian society, that you need a little extra explanation and context for. Every once in a while, if you've never raised sheep, if you've never had to do any of these other things, if you're not into pearl arbitrage and buying and selling pearls for money, you might need a little context for what Jesus is teaching. This one does not need any explanation. The man had too much food, and instead of thinking of what he could do for God with it, he thought of how long he could live off of it without having to do any more work. Oh, I'm rich now. I can take it easy. I'll have this grain for many years. No more work for me. Eat, drink, and be merry. Nothing confusing about that. Whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God is going to perish like this man. The value of wealth from Jesus' perspective, does not lie in the ease and comfort it gives to the one who possesses it, but in how it enables us to bless God. The value of wealth is not how long your retirement gets to be, but how much you can dedicate to the Lord. The value of wealth is determined by how you invest it in your eternal salvation. Verse 22 will pick up and continue from here. Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storehouse or barn, yet God feeds them. How much more are you valuable than birds? Who of you by worrying can add a single hour of life to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown to the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." All right. If you read that passage, and Jesus says, don't worry about food, and Jesus says, don't worry about clothes, think about the answer to this honestly. Do you think Jesus is saying, don't work for your food and don't work for your clothes? No. What Jesus is very clearly saying is, you already work and get these things. You can obtain these things for yourself. Ravens don't work for their food, they just find it lying around. You know how to feed yourself. And flowers don't clothe themselves, they just come up out of the ground that way. So if you know how to work and to buy clothes and to make clothes and all these other things, don't worry. The flowers don't toil and spin, but you can toil and spin. So you don't need to worry about food because you can grow it. You don't need to worry about clothes because you can make it. And God will clothe you and God will feed you based on those things. There's no room for interpretation here that says Jesus is saying, well, just follow along whatever the Lord wants, and then the things that you need will come in your path. And you'll just be able to pick them up as you go for free. I don't think that's what's happening here. Actually, there was a story that they used to tell in my family of an acquaintance of one of our extended family members who had a bad habit of misinterpreting this passage on purpose. He believed that because Jesus said you don't have to worry about anything, if he saw something and it wasn't nailed down, that meant that God wanted him to have it. So he would go and sit in people's cars and flip the visor down, and if the keys were there, my car now, and he'd take off in it. Now, whether that story is fabulated or not, the point is that God does not intend for us to merely find the things that we need for life along the path. There is work to be done. But what do we do with the products of that work? The man who had all of the abundant harvest, he invested time, energy, money, hiring guys to do some of the work probably. He planted the crops and he reaped the crops, but his barns were too small. But instead of having the thought of, my barns are too small, but my neighbors are hungry. My barns are too small, but I need to take my portion into the temple for my tithe. My barns are too small, but I could do something good with this. His thought was, I need bigger barns. So do you get the point? It's not that the work doesn't need to happen. It's what do you do with the product of your work? In other words, who does the products of your work belong to? Are they yours or are they God's? So don't worry about your food because you know how to go work and feed yourself. Don't worry about clothes because you can go and make yourself something to wear. But do worry when you have more than you need. Do be concerned, worry's maybe not the right word, with what to do with your abundance. That's what Jesus is teaching here. He says, if that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? And do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink, and do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after such things. And your Father knows that you need them, but seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Now here's where we haven't read yet. Verse 32 says the following. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give them to the poor. Provide purses to yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I wanted to read to this verse because I think he's still talking to the men who said, make my brother divide the possession with me. Make my brother divide the inheritance up, Jesus. I think Jesus is saying, you've got enough. Don't worry about the stuff your parents used to have. Sell that off, give it to the poor. And then you're going to have an abundance in heaven. Because I tell you something about an inheritance or another kind of a windfall like that. You didn't need it before it happened, and you don't need it now. These guys didn't need their parents' money when their parents were still alive, and they didn't need it after their parents died, and they were fighting about how to split it up. It would do them more good to give it to other people who were in poverty than it would to break their brotherhood up fighting over who was going to get what portion of it. Now, that's not what Jesus says word for word. Maybe I'm adding a little interpretation in there. But the principle is in place. Jesus said, don't worry about these material things because that's what the pagans do. They chase after it. They spend their whole life trying to get rich. Instead, when you find yourself with an abundance, it says right here, in Jesus' own words, sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. And finally, Jesus teaches a very important lesson. It's not just that you shouldn't have worldly wealth, and all Christians should permanently live in poverty out of some sort of like self-righteous spiritual punishment that we undergo. Right? Oh, I'm too rich. I got to get rid of my money so God will love me again. No. When you invest in heaven, your mind and your heart are also focused on heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If you flinch whenever the stock market goes up or down, if you watch the ticker at the bottom of the screen to watch where the gold market is this week, if you're listening to the earnings calls on a company to see how your shares are doing, you know what I'm talking about because you have an interest in what goes on in those material things. Your mind is occupied by those material things. Now, did I ascribe any sort of morality to any of those things? Did I tell you was right or wrong? But what did Jesus say? Where your treasure is, your heart will be also. What do you value? Where do you invest with your heart? All right, Luke 16. Another instance where Jesus is talking about money. And then this is one where he's going to use money, or rather he's going to tell us how to use money in a more sort of direct way. He said sell and give to the poor here. That's pretty direct. That makes sense. But he's going to provide a little spiritual motivation beyond what we saw in the last passage. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also is deep. But it's also brief. It makes sense. Whatever you have spent your money and your time and your effort on, that's what you'll care about. But in chapter 16, we run into this parable that I've heard people sort of run up against like it's a brick wall, because they're trying to interpret it in a way that is favorable to their material conditions on earth, and not one that's favorable to the spiritual conditions God is trying to create in us. Luke 16 says the following. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be a manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will come welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings." This guy gets accused of not making enough money for the owner of the business, the master of the company, basically. The operations are supposed to be bringing in a profit, and this guy is apparently wasting more than he's earning. But then he goes around and cuts their potential revenue. He cuts the accounts that they have due, and the owner of the company, his master, praises him for it. Why is that? Why does that make sense? Well, because if all you're doing is wasting money, anybody can do that. Anybody can take money and just burn it. Easy to do. I could prove it if anybody wants to give me a chance. I'm just kidding. But what's a lot more prudent, a lot more shrewd, is to use what could be considered by some a waste to gain a relationship. Would you rather give somebody the friends and family discount and have them come back next time, or come around and invite you to dinner, come around and help you out next time you need something, or always collect every cent that you're owed and never have any friends? Just from a pure worldly standpoint, Christian values aside, it might monetarily, on the surface, sort of make sense if you were a computer. But as soon as you take it and you put it in a human perspective, of course it makes sense. Building business relationships is very, very important. My brother-in-law works in accounts payable at the bank, which means that when people take clients out to lunch, he's the one who approves or disapproves of their tickets they turn in. And he sees some really ridiculous prices on some of these meals, because a lot of the business they do is in the Washington, D.C. area. Figure that out. So a lot of the prices are pretty high over there in that part of Virginia and Maryland and everything. And so they go through and they scrutinize all the items. Was this really a business meal? Why is there a kid's meal included on this supposed business luncheon? Stuff like that. The reason why they pay for those things is because it's better to take a client out for lunch and pay $200 for him to have a fancy steak and then land his $2 million account than to tell him, well, I don't have any time for you on my schedule, but maybe we can figure out what your account's going to look like next week, and so good luck with that, right? You can understand from a physical, temporary, earthly perspective why those kind of relationships make sense. Now listen to what Jesus says next. I'm going to pick up in verse 9 where we've already read and continue. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So it will not have been trustworthy. Let me try verse 11 again. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight." What would it mean to be trustworthy with worldly wealth in Jesus' perspective? Jesus, the guy who says, sell all your possessions, give to the poor. Jesus, the guy who says, the ravens eat, so don't worry about food. Jesus, the teacher who teaches, don't worry about your clothes because flowers are clothed beautifully. What does he say a person needs to be doing to be trustworthy with worldly wealth? Because whoever's trusted with a little can be trusted with a lot. So what does it mean to be trustworthy? I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. So if you're trustworthy with material goods, if you're trustworthy with worldly wealth, it doesn't mean that you're lending at a usurious interest rate and gaining a lot of fees back for yourself. If you're trustworthy with worldly wealth, it doesn't mean that you're putting it into all of the right kinds of accounts, investing in the right businesses, and earning a lot of capital to then reinvest. If you are trustworthy with worldly wealth, it means being trustworthy with what has been invested in you for the purposes of that original investor. That's a capital I investor there, by the way. I'm talking about God. You know, I've heard of angel investors before, but we've got something higher than that. God has given us sometimes very little, but the one who can be trusted with very little can be trusted with very much. But the point that Jesus is making more importantly here is it doesn't matter how much worldly wealth you have, it is very little compared to our heavenly wealth. It doesn't matter how rich you are on earth, you have a tiny fraction of what God has in store for you in heaven. So what are you doing with your tiny fraction right now? Because you can't earn more heaven for yourself, but you can have friends welcome you and gain them for heavenly purposes. You can earn more people for God's goals. If God's two goals, the two primary objectives he has for us is to love him and love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And those are the main things we are to be doing with our spiritual energy, with our bodies, with our minds, with our life, and the things that we try to do with our hands. Does money somehow get accepted from that formula? Do we somehow get to take our accounts and set them to the side when we're talking about being wholly devoted to God? And that's with a WH, by the way. One thing that I've heard people say is, well, if I won the lottery, or if I had unlimited wealth, if I was the richest person, here's the first good thing I would do. End world hunger. Build homes for all the children that are homeless right now. I would invest money in whatever medical things I could and cure all the curable diseases that people die from every day. Forget all of the incurable things. You know how many hundreds of people and thousands of people die moment to moment just from curable diseases that if they could have just got to a doctor, they would have been healthy? There's so many people who say, well, if I was only rich enough, I would do good with it. If I was only rich enough, then I would help somebody. If I only had all the money in the world, that's when I'd start doing good things. Do you start to see the problem with this? Jesus didn't say, once you're rich, then you can sell all your possessions and give to the poor. Once you're rich, then you can stop worrying. Once you're fully vested in your retirement accounts, you've got $20,000 in your mutual fund for your investments. Once you've got all of these financial fundamentals laid out, and you don't have any debt, then you can start doing good. If you can't be trusted with a little, you can't be trusted with a lot. But whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, then what does God say? Jesus says, who will trust you with true riches? There's the real punchline. The love of money that Jesus talks about here will deceive you into thinking that if you serve money, God will be pleased with you. But if you're serving God, you know that money is just another servant of God. It's just another tool that he's using to create what he wants to have happen in the world. If you can't be trustworthy with handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? If you are serving money, you are not serving God. You'll notice finally in verse 15, the last way that Jesus says this and drives it home to the Pharisees. And this is our last part of our lesson here today for ourselves as well. The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. If I was a good businessman, if I had some enterprise of my own, and I got rich, and I did well for myself, there'd probably be a few people who would want to recognize me. Show up in the newspaper, be invited to some dinners, be asked to sponsor scholarships and do this or that, come to ribbon cuttings for new businesses. These are things that happen when you're influential. Is there anything wrong with any of those? No. But if all I'm doing is seeking the approval of other people, I'm failing. If I, like the Pharisees, have convinced myself that the approval of human beings equates to the approval of God, I'm not paying attention. Because Jesus says very clearly, what is valued highly by people is despicable, despised, disgusting to God. The accumulation of wealth alone The love for money will do nothing but make God disgusted with you. But the one who can be shrewd and invest that money into his eternal prospects and the salvation of others will show himself trustworthy and be given even more, and in eternal riches that we can't even begin to imagine. I hope we're being responsible with our riches and we're treating our abundance the way Jesus wants us to treat it. I hope it's something that we can take seriously and meditate on, not as something that Ethan wants you to do, but something that Jesus was talking about. I have opinions. I have lots of them. And if you ask me about them, I'll tell you. But I hope that what you've seen today from the pulpit has been pure Bible. Because my goal was to just preach on what Jesus had to say today and apply it directly from the scriptures. The only reason I'm adding so many caveats, by the way, and trying to qualify this is people get real touchy about money. There's only one reason for that. Worry. If you're worried about tomorrow, money feels safe. But if you're worried about forever, Jesus is your only salvation. Make sure that you're eternally secure and your financial things will work themselves out, Jesus says. I hope this lesson has been edifying for you and one we can take out into our everyday lives and apply. And I hope it's been one that's been encouraging for us. I hope you can see that you've been doing things right. And if not, the instructions are very clear. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. I hope that's something we can do day to day. If you haven't been baptized for the salvation of sins or you need prayers for restoration or encouragement, we'd invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.